We had in Mexico a tragedy last week. Of course, on the financial side, Mexico had issued just recently, a few weeks ago, a bond, a catastrophic bond. What are the factors that may trigger for Mexico to get some cash from this bond after this earthquake?
There's basically just a couple, and this is something that we have been issuing for the last almost 6 years now. Basically, it's the magnitude and the location. But given that now magnitude and location actually trigger and have financial consequences, within the contract there's a 30-day period so that we can review jointly with the market, with the issuer, with the World Bank, whether both location and magnitude actually trigger the result of the bond, which would be a payment to Mexico.
You mean the location of the epicenter?
Of the earthquake, yes, of the epicenter of the earthquake.
So the preliminary information is the magnitude 8.1.
That would be covered.
That will be under coverage?
And the epicenter within our territory, that would be covered as well. But
so
typically,
yes,
we are. We are typically, when you call out both the epicenter and the magnitude, it's important for historical reasons, for record keeping. But now that it actually has an impact on a financial transaction, one needs to look at the numbers more carefully. And that's why we put in the contract that they would have, the market would have a 30-day review so as to ascertain whether or not the data is accurately and the trigger is therefore met. This would be the second time that we used it, at least. We used it under Patricia, where the scale of the meteor, the hurricane, also triggered the catastrophic bond. And the catastrophic bond complements well our architecture in terms of dealing with disasters in Mexico, because it adds an element to what we already have in terms of insurance, in terms of excess loss, and in terms of what we budget every year to face these disasters. So from a financial perspective, Mexico is well set, and we're actually at the border in terms of how we manage our risk disaster contingencies.
Regardless if you get this cash, are you planning to do any adjustments to the 2018 budget? Will you need to do adjustments to deal with this tragedy?
Mexico deals with tragedies such as this one in 3 stages. There's the emergency part of it, which we are still very much at. There's been 1,000+ movements since the earthquake last week, and we're having some rains. So there's the emergency part of it, making sure that the population is safe. There's the sort of the accounting of the cost of the related event, in this case, the earthquake, and then there's the reconstruction. We finance each one of those components differently. We take different times in sort of addressing and assessing the impact. And right now we have not only the cat bond, we have insurance for most of our public infrastructure, we have public monies in the disaster fund, and we had asked in the original draft of the budget for more resources to be allocated. We'll have more information before the end of the debate and the analysis of the economic package. So should we need to make any adjustment, I'm sure that the deputies will look at it with sympathy. With the information that we have now, we're pretty confident that from a financial perspective, we have adequate resources to face what we have seen.
Understood. Another risk that attacks you every year, Mexico's government finances, is the oil price. You do one of the biggest commodity hedges in the planet. Are you almost done with doing the program for 2018, and what kind of characteristics can you share?
Well, there's 3 elements to that, which is a buffer in our economic package. First, there's the fact that more and more we use market information so as to set the level that we put forth to Congress. So that in and of itself provides a certain level of certainty.
And it's going to be 46 according to your
46, which is roughly where the futures would have the price of oil on average being last year. So that gives us an element of certitude. There's a second element that's relatively recent. We've established a stability fund within the budget so that allows us to have a fund that's there in case there's a shortfall in our budgetary income, be it because of taxes or because of oil. That has about 180 billion pesos in there. So that's a good amount to have, and that allows us more flexibility when we access the market in terms of the prices that we're looking at, so that the combination of the two, what we have in the fund and what we cover in the market, actually provide support to the price that we set in the budget. We're in the process of finishing the coverage program. As always, we'll give full details and full disclosure once we're done. But at this stage, we're pretty confident that the combination of the stabilization fund plus the coverage gives good and adequate support for the $46 that we put there in the budget.
Would you say you're 90% completed of that program, 80%, 95%?
No, we wouldn't. As you said, it's a large program. So what we do every year is once we're completely done, we give the full details, but we're far enough advanced so that we're confident in saying that the $46 coverage and stabilization fund have ample and good support.
Just comparing to previous years, one thing that is different for Mexico now is that the gasoline prices are semi-liberalized. Did that imply that you have to increase a little bit the volume, that you have to protect your risk?
There's that element to it, and that played a role in terms of looking at how much we would cover. But there's an additional element, both because the platform is smaller and the price is also significantly lower to what we saw in the past. The degree to which our public finances rely on oil revenues is now much decreased. So our sensitivity to changes in the price of oil, the impact that it would have on our public finances has been reduced. So it's larger to be marginally higher in terms of the fact that we don't have the natural coverage that we used to have, because now our energy balance is pretty much in tune. We almost export as much as we import. We export oil and we import gasolines. But it's also true that the margin to which our public finances are exposed to changes in the price of oil has been dramatically reduced as well. Just in 2012, about 36 to 37% of our revenues were oil related. That number went down to 16.
So with those factors, it would be right to assume that the cost was a little bit lower than previous year, giving me
roughly the similar amount. Okay. But again, we'll have full details as it is done. And at this stage, I think from the perspective of the debate on our budget, 46 seems reasonable, both because we are able to cover it well between market and stabilization fund, and because it's very much in tune with what the market expects in terms of the information that we get from futures market.
Talking more about volatility, 2018, that's pretty much most of the banks agree that there is going to be, again, a jump in Mexico's volatility for the peso. Do you think the tools that we are using currently in Mexico, and mainly the hedges on FX, are enough to deal with the expected volatility, or do you expect to use other tools?
Well, first, I think it's useful to recognize that for a long time, the toolbox for the Foreign Exchange Commission did not have the possibility for us to sell these non-deliverable forwards. So it was a welcome addition, I think, to the toolkit of the Exchange Commission. But if one looks overall, Mexico has a good level of reserves. We have access to the flexible credit line. We have the possibility of discretionary intervening, which we use sparingly. We've used it and we will continue to use it as we see fit. But in the last couple of years, we've only used it twice. We have the program authorized up to $20 billion in terms of non-deliverable forwards that we've used $1 billion of, and which we have renewed the nominal amount each time it came due. That has proven, I think, to be a welcome and a useful addition in terms of our toolbox. But all of that comes together with the fact that we put forth, I think, a relatively conservative and consistent economic package. So from the perspective of things that we can control and that we have committed to doing, I think we come into 2018 with a conservative economic package that basically complies to what we committed going back to 2013. If you compare Mexico to other emerging economies in the G20 or to Latin America, we're probably moving ahead of the curve in terms of recuperating our fiscal space. We are one of the few that are going to be running a primary surplus. We're one of the few that are going to have a decreasing profile of debt to GDP ratio. So from the perspective of public finances, we're going to do well. I think we have a good toolkit in terms of our Foreign Exchange Commission, and I think that we have well-anchored expectations in terms of inflation a credible and consistent policy stance in terms of fiscal. So in the elements that we can control, the market should find confidence that Mexico will continue to do well in terms of the way that we manage our macro stance.
And you told us about those inflation expectations that you saw like a possibility that there was going to be room at the end of the year maybe to be on a cycle of cutting rates. Do you see still that possibility? Or what
we put forth in the budget is basically the assumption that the exchange rate would stay as it is. Our average, that might or might not be conservative, but what we try to do in terms of looking at monetary policy and reflecting in the budget is basically be conservative, look at market estimates, and just be very respectful of the autonomy and the policy decisions that are made by the central bank.
As you know, you are one of the names that they mention as a potential replacement for Agustin Carstens at the central bank. We also know that your name is mentioned as a possibility to run as candidate of the ruling party. Is there a possibility where there's not replacement yet for Carstens, and he has to leave? Is there a possibility where somebody within the Banxico board is appointed to head the central bank, and they're short of the needed people for the board, or do you think that's not going to be the case?
My perception, I think, both in terms of what ends up happening to me and what happens in terms of the board, that's a decision that's going to be taken further on within the year. The bank is a very strong and very highly reputable institution. It has worked well for Mexico for the past 20 years. The bank is well, this year turned 92. But it has enjoyed autonomy and it has benefited the country since '94. So at this stage, the only thing that's certain is that today I'm the Minister of Finance, and I hope to continue to do a good job throughout the package.
I have heard that answer.
That's a good one, I think. That goes back to orthodoxy and classicism, and I think that's a positive note.
Let's switch to NAFTA.
Yeah.
Several people in the government in different sides of the negotiations, they say that right at the beginning of the talks, maybe we can aim to wrap this up by the end of the year, by the end of 2017. Now, after 2 rounds of negotiations, do you think that's feasible, or should we start thinking maybe it's going to be a longer process?
I don't know yet. 7 rounds were pre-committed to, and I think that what can be said at this stage is that the rounds have evolved not only as scheduled, but I think that the rounds have evolved as one would have expected them to evolve this early in the negotiating process. So at this stage, I think the fact that we still have 5 more rounds to go, the fact that the conversations are going well, in terms of the expectations that we have, those would not have changed. I think that we have more or less moved into the negotiation process as scheduled. The ambitions of all of the parties well known, and the conversations, I think, at the end of each of the rounds have ended on a positive note.
What is the biggest ambition goal for Mexico? What do you really are going to make sure that Mexico reaches on these negotiations or protects in these negotiations?
We think that the North American integration process is something that creates value for the region. If one looks at trade is now trade between regions, and the North American Free Trade Agreement gave, I think, the North American region an important competitive advantage. If one looks at trade today, there's a lot of our trade that happens even within Mexico and the U.S. outside of the North American Free Trade Agreement, which means that there has been a convergence between the North American Free Trade Agreement and the World Trade Organization framework. I think our level of ambition is that the Free Trade Agreement with North America makes us more competitive in a way that moves us away from just the World Trade Organization advantages and really provides new impetus and a better underpinning for an integration process that I think has been key in making North America dynamic and North America competitive.
A political question. You know that for several months the candidate or the politician leading the polls is Andrés Manuel López Obrador. For the international reader or viewer, what's your take on what's the biggest misconception about Andrés Manuel López Obrador?
Well, I think that the electoral process formally just started on the 8th of September. I think there's still a lot of uncertainties in terms of what will happen with the other parties.
Yeah, but
who will end up
López
containing.
Obrador, what's your take on him?
Well, he's well known. He's been campaigning for 18 plus years. I think that he has put forth many interesting debates, and I don't think he has put as much interesting solutions as the interest in the debates. But again, I think that at this stage the campaigns haven't yet started. I don't think that people are as fixated on them as we are within, not just government, but within the political environment. I think that what's going to be decided in 2018 is important in terms of the direction that the country will take, in terms of 20 plus years of working to create a good policy environment, not just in terms of macro, but in terms of changing the structure of many of our micro markets. So I think at some point it's going to be interesting for all of us to start putting attention and weighting each one of the alternatives as they present not just a diagnostic but the solutions.
If you were the candidate of Mexico's largest party, do you think you have a shot in beating him on the elections next year, and why?
I think it's early to speculate. I think at this stage, but let me say, regardless of whether I am or not, I think that the country today is in a good direction. I think that we've managed to consolidate good public finances. We're in the process of implementing the most relevant set of structural reforms that the country has seen in this generation at the very least. And we are starting to change the way that our architecture functions in terms of rule of law. I think the next administration will have the challenge of probably working the other way around, starting with the rule of law, continuing to implement the structural reforms, and taking as given that Mexico will continue to have stable finances. So I think that today the country and whoever the candidates are, and regardless of whether it's me or not, there is going to be, I think, a narrative that supports that the efforts that the country has undertaken are efforts that are worthwhile, that are efforts that merit some continuation in terms of their implementation, that they need probably as all reforms to be fine-tuned, that there are other challenges that we need to address. But I think that there is going to be a narrative that I think is going to be attractive in terms that the efforts that have been put into transforming Mexico are efforts that have been worthwhile.